Well, good afternoon. It's Wednesday and time for our Judeo-Christian Catechism program. Our episode tonight is really an introduction to the covenants of God, and we will take several weeks to go through them in a little more detail. Now, when we do the catechism, we give the basic information, and so we're not going to go into exhaustive detail on the covenants, but there's a need to understand them, and there's a need to understand the relationship between the covenants. And so we'll be looking specifically at that. Now we're going to begin with what is a covenant. Covenant is a promise or an agreement that's made between two parties. Now, sometimes a covenant can be a one-sided, unconditional, I'm going to do this. Then we tend to call that a promise. An agreement that involves two parties where each has something to do in there tends to be a conditional agreement, although there are times when a person may meet their obligation even when the other person doesn't. And in the case of God, that sometimes happens. And so we have to look at these covenants not so much as conditional or unconditional, but exactly what is going on in the promises, what is going on in the agreement, and what is going on in the sign of the covenant that is given. Now, if a person doesn't do what they're supposed to do, then they have broken the covenant. Doesn't necessarily mean that the covenant is broken, that is, it's no longer functioning. It means that they may bring upon themselves some punitive aspects of the covenant. And then, of course, if they go back to doing what the covenant requires, then they're no longer breaking the covenant. So we have to be careful not to think of if a covenant is broken, then it's done away with. And then, of course, the sign of the covenant is the physical reminder of the covenant or the signifier of the covenant. And it's a marker to those who are part of the covenant as a reminder and an agreement. So we're going to look at each of those in the context of the major biblical covenants. Now, when we talk about the biblical covenants, when we first put together our Judeo-Christian Catechism, we really only talked about three major covenants. We talked about the Abrahamic covenant, we talked about the Mosaic covenant, we talked about the New Covenant. And part of the reason was as we were beginning to give people into the Judeo-Christian faith, our struggle was trying to understand the relationship between the Mosaic covenant, the covenant at Sinai, and the New Covenant. As time went on and as we talked people, it became clear that if you don't really understand the five major covenants, you're not going to be able to really see that relationship between those. So we're going to talk about five major biblical covenants. There are other covenants, but these five really establish what God is doing, and particularly the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. So we will begin with the covenant with Noah. Now, this covenant with Noah could be called the covenant with the creation, and we'll talk about that. And then we'll look at the covenant with Abraham. The Abrahamic covenant could also, in some sense, be called the covenant with the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But it really begins with Abraham. Then we'll talk about the Mosaic covenant or the covenant at Sinai. This is the covenant that God made with Israel when he brought them out of Egypt and established them. It was a covenant that had both blessings and curses in it. Then we'll look at the Davidic covenant, the covenant with David. And that one really is about the monarchy itself, the throne of David and the son of David, which is clearly the Messiah in that context. But also, this one addresses the priestly office as well. And so we will look at that specifically. And then we have to look at the new covenant. The new covenant, probably one that is somewhat understated in Judaism and misunderstood and misapplied often in Christianity. So we're going to look at all five of these: the Noahic or creation covenant, the Abrahamic or patriarchal covenant, the Mosaic covenant or the Sinai covenant, the Davidic covenant, the one with the monarchy and the priesthood, and then the new covenant. And we will look at that in some detail. And when we look at the new covenant, we're going to have to look at the gospel, because the relationship between the gospel and the new covenant is both important and in many cases misapplied. So we'll need to look at that in a little more detail. Now, I'm not going to talk about each one in detail, but I want to give you some biblical passages to look at related to those. So, for example, the covenant with Noah. In order to understand that, you really need to look at Genesis 8:20 through 9:17. So make sure you read that, because next week we'll specifically look at that covenant. And then, of course, you want to look at the covenant with Abraham, and that's found in Genesis chapter 17. Now, it's followed up in others, but we will focus primarily on Genesis 17 and then go from there. The third covenant, the Mosaic covenant, really takes in the entire Torah story. But we're going to look at it specifically from Deuteronomy chapter 28 through 30. And so it's very important that you look at those chapters so that you understand the conditional nature of the blessings and the cursings of that covenant. And then, of course, we'll do the Davidic covenant. The Davidic covenant is found in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8 through 17. And we will look at some other passages that address that, particularly some in the New Testament that go back and touch on that covenant. And it's amazing how much that is found in the liturgical aspects of Christian worship, but not well understood, particularly by evangelicals. And so we'll take a look at that one as well. And then finally, we'll look at Jeremiah 31 and following, and some passages related to that in Ezekiel that are about the new covenant. That is clearly a major focus of the book of Hebrews and of the Christian church. But many times it is misapplied or seen in an improper relationship to the other covenant. So we'll look at those as well. So over the several weeks, we're going to be looking at the the covenants in that sense. Now, I want to give kind of a brief overview right now. Hopefully, you'll look at those scripture readings that we gave you and be ready for it. We'll begin next week with the Noahic covenant. I'll try to get also to the Abrahamic covenant. I'd like to be able to do this in about 3 weeks. It may take 4, it could take 5. I'm hoping not to do it quite in that amount of time, because we want to keep these relatively short and direct for the catechism purposes. Clearly, there's much more that could be done. So the Noahic covenant is really the covenant related to the creation. It's about the creation and its inhabitants, which includes human beings and the animals and the plants in that sense. It's really about time. It's really about seasons. It's really about the idea of a continuity connecting the present heaven and earth in distinction from the earth and heaven that was prior to the flood of Noah, and the heavens and earth that will be in the new heaven and the new earth, what's called the new creation. And so it's really about that, and in some sense, that covenant establishes the parameters for the other covenants. The sign of that covenant, of course, is the rainbow, and we'll talk about that and why that's important, and how to make use of the when you see a rainbow, just as God does that as well. So the Noahic covenant really sets a parameter for this creation between the world that was, the world that is, and the world that is to come. We'll talk about that in more detail next week. The Abrahamic covenant is really an important and foundational covenant. While it sits on that Noahic covenant, it really has its own special focus, and that is that God is selecting a person to create a people for his name. And those people will receive the promise of God in the land of promise. And so Abraham is given the promise of a son that will become a people. He's given the promise of a land that is there, and he will be a blessing to all the peoples that would be part of that Noahic covenant. We'll take a look at that. There is a sign for the Abrahamic covenant. That sign is circumcision. Circumcision of the males on the 8th day. And that sign is critical, and we'll talk about why it's critical. And that sign will carry on into the Mosaic covenant, but it is really the Abrahamic covenant. And that gives us an understanding of the relationship of the covenants. They don't replace each other. One replaces the next, out with the old and in with the new. That's a misunderstanding. They really unfold. Upon the foundation of the covenant with Noah comes the Abrahamic covenant, which will then be expanded and unfolded into the Mosaic and Sinaitic covenant, as we call it. And then that will be brought into fullness in the context of the new covenant. And only in the new creation, and only when this heaven and this earth passes away, will those former parts of the covenants go away, and those aspects that are related to the new creation will be carried on into that context. And we'll talk about that and what the gospel means in that context. Now, the Mosaic covenant is really a covenant of Israel being in the land. They will be in the land. They will be blessed as they are obedient. They will be cursed if they are disobedient. They will ultimately be dispersed into the other countries and then ultimately brought back by God into that land where he will make sure that they fulfill all of the commandments in their fullness. And he will do that in a sense, by means of the new covenant. So the new covenant is not a covenant that replaces the old covenant, but in some sense brings into fullness that Mosaic covenant. We'll talk about that. And then, of course, there is the Davidic covenant. Oh, by the way, the sign of the Mosaic covenant is the Shabbat, the Sabbath. And it is found right at the beginning of Genesis. In fact, the whole creation narrative is really about the Sabbath, and the second chapter of Genesis really about marriage. And so we really have to see these in that context in order to understand that sign of the Sabbath given to Israel, very important as that sign between them and God. The Davidic covenant is really about giving David a dynasty, a house, a place for his throne to continue. The throne, which is the rulership over the promised land. So you can see this ties back to the promise of Abraham. It also ties into the blessings and curses that are found in the Mosaic covenant. And then, of course, he says, I will give you a son who will sit upon your throne. And that throne ultimately is the throne that the Messiah will sit on. And that's an important part of this, because if Yeshua or Jesus is the Messiah, as we believe he is, then he must be connected to this Davidic covenant and not sit on his father's throne in heaven, though he is now as high priest sitting at the right hand of the Father. But he must sit on the throne of his father David and rule the nations with a rod of iron in that context. So we have to talk about that. And that son who is given is the sign of the Davidic covenant, and really important that we understand that in both relationship to the first coming of the Messiah, or the suffering one, and the return of the Messiah, or the coming of the Messiah to reign. And we'll talk about that as well. And then the new covenant is not about getting rid of the commandments of God. It's about getting rid of the flesh. getting rid of the sin, so that the commandments of God may be fully expressed in his people, not only in his people Israel, but to some extent in a reflection sense in the people from the nations, which he will call through what Paul calls the mystery of the gospel. And so we'll need to talk about this is a matter of the heart and a change of the flesh, ultimately a resurrection. And we'll see that in that context. And then, of course, the sign will be the gathering of Israel and the gathering of those from the nations and the resurrection from the dead and the kingdom to come, wherein all the righteousness of the obedience of the commandments will be seen and will be expressed. And so we need to take a look at that in its fullness. So over the next several weeks, we're going to look at the covenant with Noah and the creation. We're going to look at the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Davidic covenant, the new covenant. We're going to see how these things are connected almost as a flower bud that unfolds and unfolds and unfolds rather than replaces the old with the new. That notion really is what the new creation will be with regard to this creation. And at that point, of course, the Noahic covenant will cease, and some of the other aspects that are more temporal will be removed, so that in the new creation, the fullness of the new covenant and the fullness of the commandments of God and the light of God and the God dwelling with his people, both Israel and the God-fearers who have been redeemed from the nations will be seen in that context. So we're going to look at all of those. We'll begin next week looking at the Noahic covenant, and we'll try to get to the Abrahamic covenant. So at least read those Genesis passages that we talked about. Let me remind you of them again. You want to read for next week Genesis chapter 8, verse 20 through chapter 9, verse 17. And then, of course, you want to read Genesis chapter 17. And we'll take a look at those first two covenants and try to make some sense of those and lay the foundation for the unveiling and the expansion in the other covenants. So I hope you're looking forward to that. Our catechism, we will do a brief and clear overview of these. We'll go into enough detail to understand them, but certainly there's much more detail that could be gone in. And that, of course, is what our faith is about, is to grow in grace and in knowledge of the Lord. So until next week, we will say goodbye, and I hope you'll read and be prepared for that. Goodbye.